Detention Watch Network is a national coalition in the United States where we are working to end immigration detention. So we don't believe anybody should be incarcerated for their immigration status. And so a lot of our work focuses on, um, doing both like organizing with grassroots organizations, supporting their local campaigns to stop detention center expansion or to shut down existing facilities. We do also a lot of advocacy at the state level and also federal level to often either try to have like proactive strategies to stop detention expansion or to try to stop really harsh legislation, especially at the federal level. A lot of that work focuses on the federal budget and how much money is going to these systems. We also do a lot of narrative work because we know that that's a really big challenge here, just around a lot of narratives around good immigrants versus bad immigrants or, new immigrants versus old immigrants and trying to really push against this idea and the sort of divisions that are sowed. And so we work with groups all across the country who are grassroots organizations, but also policy organizations, people who provide direct service to immigrants who are in detention, and people who themselves have been detained before or their family members or loved ones are detained. Yeah, so for many years there's been this like legislative strategy in the US for comprehensive immigration reform, and often the sort of intention around that is to support some immigration while also creating even more restrictions and more enforcement, either through border militarization or also more criminalization of immigrants. It's a strategy that has kind of fully divided immigrant communities, but fully divided communities of color, working class, poor communities. And so I think it's been really, really damaging. So what we've seen over the years, and especially under the Obama administration or Biden administration, in the US, these more sort of quote unquote liberal administrations, there's been this sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant, like an immigrant who is deserving of legal status versus those who are considered more disposable because they might be newly arriving or because they've had some contact with the criminal legal system. And so those administrations really, really leaned into that framework. And what we're seeing now is that the Trump administration is just saying, actually, like all immigrants are bad. And so like there isn't any sort of um distinction or, you know, prioritization of who's going to be targeted. And a lot of the reason why we've made the case against that sort of those really harmful criminalizing narratives is that this is sort of what ends up happening is more and more people become subject to these conditions because they say some people are deserving of this or they're implementing policies that dehumanize immigrants at the border that makes people believe that immigrants who are living in the US don't deserve these rights also. And so it's always this sort of tension there. But what we've seen on the Trump administration is things are changing to some degree. There's a lot of expansion of detention throughout the country, more private prisons, more county jails, more facilities in general, the use of military bases, the use of different types of institutions. So federal prisons are being used for immigration detention. Um, and there's just like a sort of blanket policy across the board, like target anyone and regardless of their status. So it actually doesn't, targeting people who have green cards. That's something we've seen for a long time, especially because people have had some contact with the criminal legal system. But now you've seen students who have expressed solidarity with the with Palestine and with Palestinians now being targeted, even when they have a green card, even when they have a visa, because of their protests, because of their actions, and essentially for thought crimes, which is really scary, which is sort of veers into authoritarianism. And I think that's sort of the thing that's happening now is that they're weaponizing the system and using it as a testing ground for authoritarianism, which is really, really concerning. And then the other thing that's been happening is that they've been shipping migrants who are living here that they've taken into custody. And, there's been a lot of attention on the mega prison in El Salvador that's being used, but people are being shipped across the world, most recently in South Sudan. And so that is also really concerning. I know that's something that people, other countries in the world have done for a long time. The US has the largest prison system in the world, so we also have the largest detention system, but this is sort of new terrain that we're navigating right now. And so those shifts are really scary. And I think there is this like attention on the denial of due process, which is concerning. But I think the thing we have to remember is that for decades now, they've been stripping rights from immigrants and people of color and poor people by building up these systems. And a lot of this is building on top of that. I think one of the real challenges about this moment, because there's these measures that the Trump administration is taking that seem out of bounds, like far-reaching, there is this sort of more acceptance of the things that have been happening. So, for instance, like more, I guess, traditional detention, as for lack of a better word, like we'll see, um, you know, county jails and private prisons and federal facilities used, and those things are expanding rapidly, and they're kind of getting normalized because these other types of detention is happening by offshoring detention or putting people in military bases, and those kind of get the attention. So I think we have to find a balance there. But I also think, you know, there's so much that in US society is like there's like an obsession with innocence and punishment. And so like what we're seeing right now is that people really lean into this idea that somebody is, not deserving of this because they're innocent, because they haven't had contact with the criminal legal system, and that ends up creating this idea that anybody that has had contact with the criminal legal system, or maybe came to like came to the country because they were fleeing violence, like they're more deserving of detention versus, like saying people have been here for 20 years and look at it, look, what they're doing to this person and they're a father. And I think those things, yes, we need to humanize everybody who has experienced this, but I do think there is this element of like, oh, well, whenever you have this idea that some people are the sort of perfect immigrant, the good immigrant, it implies that somebody is undeserving and not actually worthy of certain rights or humanity or dignity. And so I think we have to do a lot of the work to kind of make sure we're complicating sort of what's happened to get us to this point that, and this is something like abolitionist perspective really teaches us, is that when you accept that some people are deserving of detention and deportation or imprisonment, then the kind of scope of who is at risk and the scope of who is targeted just keeps expanding. I also think the other thing I would just say about this sort of like perspective of people who are academics or lawyers or other people being targeted at the border or ports of entry. Um, I think like one that's not happening at a huge scale. Like, yes, it's happening and that's scary, but I also think like still the people who are most vulnerable are people who aren't documented in community or people who are having contact with the criminal legal system, or who are, coming to the border to seek asylum. I think those are the people who are most vulnerable. And ultimately, I think the goal is to instill fear in people. And so that is what is, and it's been very, very effective. And so even if it's not happening at scale, like all these people are now scared to travel or to move in certain ways. And I think that's what's actually even like in addition to that happening, what's really scary is how much they're really controlling people's movements or what they do. So the US is in some ways unique because of its prison system. So the way that the US has one of the largest prison systems in the world. It incarcerates people at a really, really high rate. Um, and that has been sort of applied to immigration, which meant that the US ended up having the largest immigration detention system in the world. Which meant that actually some of the things that happen in other countries, like Australia or Israel or Denmark or UK, where they'll actually offshore detention and say, okay, we're going to send people to Rwanda or somewhere else. Like those things um, didn't often happen. There would be a policy in the US where there'd be like a third country agreement or some form of interdiction to stop the sort of, increase of migrants trying to come to the US to seek asylum. But for the most part, there wasn't this process of taking people who currently live in the US and transferring them, essentially trafficking them to other detention centers where, in some cases, especially in this context of El Salvador, like a real question of are they going to be released? What does this look like in the long run? And I also think even right now, there's conversations in this administration that's like, do we even ship people who are US citizens to some of these places? And I think that is something that we're sort of reckoning with. And so what I'll just say is that, the US often in the way, frustratingly, in the sort of immigrant rights, immigrant justice world, it's been such an insular conversation, which is not actually what traditionally it had been for many years, especially in the 1980s when there was a sanctuary movement and the US was backing wars in Central America, and there was a lot more internationalism to the approach that immigrant justice struggles took to this work. But I think in the recent past, because of so much attention on legislative strategies and these sort of more patriotic strategies, there wasn't as much of an international solidarity and work that was happening. And I think this moment, both in terms of how the Trump administration has been, you know, offshoring detention and doing it in this, and it's very much in that like the cruelty is the point way, like the fact that they're saying we're going to send people to places like South Sudan or Ukraine. There's a very particular intention there. And so I think that gives us, like, sort of reveals to us why we need to have a more internationalist politics. Um, and I also, of course, think that you know, the war in Gaza, what is happening there, and the sort of role actually Gaza plays as like a laboratory for a lot of the policies we see on the US-Mexico border is a sort of moment to say, okay, how do we really deeply make these connections? The other thing I would say, though, is that like the narratives are actually quite similar. There's still the sort of good immigrant versus bad immigrant, new immigrant versus old immigrant. There's these sort of, I mean, and race is a sort of unequivocal factor in terms of how immigration is treated. So I think even if some of the policies are different or some of the approaches have been different over time, I think a lot of the narratives are similar across the world when it comes to immigration. And those are some things that we can sort of learn from each other and figure out how to tackle. Think it's a really hard time because I think it's a time for there were many years when I was doing this work and, have been organizing against immigration detention for over 20 years where we would just regularly lose campaigns and we would just lose and lose and lose. But then eventually we started winning and it was because there were certain openings. So I think the best advice that I have for people is to keep going and sort of think about like locally what's happening. What is happening with migrant communities? Is there offshoring of detention? Is there detention happening? Sort of understanding those systems, documenting the violence and the abuse that's happening in those systems, I think is really important, and sort of exposing that and exposing what's happening to people is deeply important. I also think this is a time for political education. Um, there's so many ways that we can say, oh wait, this is new and this is, you know, unprecedented and all these things. And it's actually, no, these are building up on policies that have been in place for many, many years and just sort of making them even worse. And so how do we do the work to say, actually, the system itself is the problem and the way that it's approached this? And now you have these authoritarian leaders who are actually weaponizing existing systems that have been so harmful. And so that political education is essential, and working with migrant communities. So like all of those pieces together, as you start building that up, and then there's potential for opening. And we saw this here in the United States in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter uprisings that summer, there was a lot of openings all of a sudden, and we could get elected officials to say, we're going to end this detention contract. And we were able to kind of like get to that place. And so I think it's building up, doing that, what Ella Baker calls like spade work to build up communities and make sure we have that capacity when there are openings. I think those are the things that I would say. And find your community, find the people that you can do this work with.